Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that you, our listeners, have been asking about: the causes of mental health problems.
It's a really important area, especially for nurses who are on the front lines of care.
Absolutely. And we've got some great resources to guide our deep dive today.
We're looking at a straight-talking introduction to the causes of mental health problems, what mental illness really is and what it isn't, and a research article that brings in some really interesting sociological perspectives.
So we're going to be weaving together insights from these different sources, exploring the biological, psychological, and social factors that all play a role.
It's a complex picture, and that's why it's so important to look at it from multiple angles.
Right. It's not just about one thing. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading these materials is how much our understanding of mental health has changed over time.
Oh, absolutely. What we consider normal or abnormal is constantly shifting. I mean, imagine trying to explain a panic attack a few centuries ago.
Oh, gosh. They probably would have thought it was demonic possession or something like that.
Exactly. Back then, mental health challenges were often attributed to supernatural forces or seen as a weakness of character.
Thankfully, we've come a long way since then.
Right. During the Renaissance, there was a gradual shift towards observation and reason, although treatments remained pretty harsh.
And then in the 19th century, you had the rise of the moral treatment movement, which emphasized humane care and a more therapeutic environment.
And that paved the way for the medical model, which really became dominant in the 20th century and continues to be influential today.
But even that is being challenged as we learn more about the complexity of mental health. It's not always a simple case of illness and cure.
Exactly. And that brings us to the classic nature versus nurture debate, which is still very much alive today.
Ah, yes. Are we shaped by our genes or our environment? Or, as I like to think of it, our wiring or our experiences?
It's a great question, and one that both of the books we're looking at address head on.
So what's the verdict? Which side wins?
Well, neither really. It's not an either situation, it's both, but in a much more nuanced way than simply picking sides. It's really about how those two forces interact.
Okay, so let's break it down a bit. Starting with the nature side of things. How much do genes actually influence our mental health?
Well, genes definitely play a role, but it's not a simple one-to-one relationship.
Yeah.
Think of it more like a predisposition. Like, you might have a genetic predisposition to heart disease, but that doesn't mean you're guaranteed to develop it.
So even if someone has a family history of depression, for example, it doesn't mean they're destined to experience it themselves.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that most mental illnesses are polygenic, meaning they're influenced by hundreds or even thousands of genes, each with a small effect. There's no single depression gene or anxiety gene.
So it's a very complex genetic landscape.
It really is.
Okay, so then what about the nurture side of the equation? How do our experiences and environment shape our mental health?
Well, our brains are constantly adapting to our environment. So, positive experiences, things like feeling safe, loved, and supported, can build resilience. Those experiences actually strengthen our mental well being.
Okay, that makes sense. So then I guess the flip side is that negative experiences, especially early in life, can create vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And this is where things like childhood trauma, abuse, or neglect can have a profound impact on our mental health later in life.
And this is something that nurses, especially those working in mental health settings, need to be really aware of.
Absolutely. Understanding a patient's social history, their childhood experiences, and the stressors they're facing in their current life can be incredibly valuable in providing effective care.
It's about seeing the whole person, not just their symptoms.
Precisely. And this actually leads us to some interesting critiques of the traditional medical model of mental illness.
Oh, okay. So the medical model, which focuses on diagnosing and treating specific disorders, is being challenged. Why is that?
Well, one of the main critiques is that it can be overly simplistic. It tends to focus on categorizing symptoms into neat little boxes, but it doesn't always capture the full complexity of human
So
experience.
it's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You're trying to force something complex into a very rigid framework.
Exactly. And this can actually lead to problems. For example, diagnostic labels, while sometimes helpful for communication and treatment planning, can also be very stigmatizing, and they can limit our understanding of the person behind the diagnosis.
Right. It's like saying you have depression without acknowledging all of the life experiences, social factors, and individual strengths that contribute to that person's unique situation.
Exactly. And this is where I think the power threat meaning framework, which we'll talk about later, can be really helpful. It encourages us to move beyond those diagnostic labels and understand the context of a person's distress.
Hmm, the power threat meaning framework. I'm definitely intrigued. We'll have to dig into that. But before we get there, I want to go back to the medical model for a moment. Our sources also mention the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And one thing they pointed out is that the DSM is constantly being revised and updated.
It is, and it's important to remember that the DSM is essentially a human construct. It's a way of categorizing and defining mental illness based on current knowledge and, to some extent, societal norms. But our understanding of mental health is always evolving.
And so the DSM has to evolve along with it. I found that example about homosexuality being listed as a mental illness in the DSM until 1973 really striking.
Oh, absolutely. It just goes to show how much our societal views can influence what we consider normal or pathological.
Right, and it's a powerful reminder that diagnoses are not set in stone.
Exactly. They're subject to cultural biases and evolving scientific understanding, so it's important to approach them with a critical eye.
Okay, so then how can nurses navigate this complex and ever-changing landscape of mental health diagnoses? I mean, especially with the DSM being a bit of a moving target.
Well, I think a key takeaway is to be cautious about over-relying on those diagnostic labels. While they can be useful for communication and treatment planning, they shouldn't define the person.
So it's about seeing the person, not just the diagnosis.
Precisely. And that means actively listening to the patient's narrative, trying to understand their unique experiences, and considering the social and cultural context of their distress.
It sounds like a much more holistic and compassionate approach to care.
It really is, and it aligns really well with one of the core messages that comes through in all of our sources, the importance of incorporating lived experience into our understanding of mental health.
Okay, so let's talk about lived experience.
Okay.
Why is it so important for nurses to listen to the stories of people with mental health challenges?
Well, one of the things that really jumped out at me when I was reading what mental illness really is and what it isn't is that people with mental health challenges, as well as their families and the general public, often attribute their difficulties more to life events, trauma, and social factors than to biological ones.
So it's not just the professionals who are recognizing the impact of these social and environmental factors, it's the people experiencing these challenges firsthand.
Exactly. And those voices need to be heard. By listening to patients' stories, understanding their perspectives, and acknowledging the role of these external factors, I think nurses can provide much more empathetic and effective care.
It's about validating their experiences and empowering them to take an active role in their recovery.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, maybe we should start looking at some of these specific social and environmental factors that can impact mental health. I mean, our sources highlight several key areas.
Yeah, let's do that. One that really stands out is poverty and social inequality. Our sources are pretty clear that these are major contributors to mental health challenges.
Right. And I think it's not hard to understand why. Imagine the constant stress of not knowing where your next meal is coming from or not being able to afford decent housing or healthcare. That kind of chronic stress takes a huge toll on mental well-being.
It's like being stuck in a constant state of fight or flight, always struggling to survive. There's no room for rest and recovery.
Exactly. And when you layer on top of that the lack of opportunity, the discrimination, and the social exclusion that often accompany poverty, it creates this really vicious cycle that can be incredibly difficult to break.
Right. It's not just about individual resilience, it's about the systemic factors that are creating these inequalities.
Absolutely. So addressing these systemic issues is crucial. We can't just focus on individual interventions. We need to advocate for social justice and work towards creating a more equitable society for everyone.
I completely agree. Okay, so poverty and inequality, that's a big one. Another major factor that our sources highlighted is trauma, abuse, and violence.
Right. And we often hear about the long-term effects of childhood trauma, but it's important to remember that trauma can happen at any age.
And it can manifest in so many different ways.
It can. So when a child experiences trauma, especially chronic or severe trauma, it can actually disrupt their brain development.
So it's not just about the emotional impact. There's a real physiological effect on the developing brain.
Exactly. And this can lead to a whole host of problems later in life, including things like difficulty regulating emotions, problems with relationships, and an increased risk of mental health disorders.
It's like the brain gets wired for survival in a dangerous environment, but that wiring can backfire later on when you're no longer in that environment.
That's a great way to put it. And for nurses, this understanding is crucial. When working with patients who have a history of trauma, it's essential to approach their care with sensitivity and recognize that their behaviors might be rooted in those past experiences.
It's about creating a safe and supportive environment where they can feel understood and begin to heal.
Absolutely. Now, in addition to poverty and trauma, our sources also discussed other social and environmental factors that can have a significant impact on mental health.
Right, and these are things that nurses also need to be mindful of. Things like loss and grief.
Yeah, those are natural parts of life.
But they can be really challenging to cope with.
They can be. And sometimes they can lead to more serious mental health concerns if the person doesn't have adequate support.
Right. And then there's discrimination and prejudice. Those are also huge factors.
Absolutely. Experiencing discrimination based on your race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, or any other factor can lead to feelings of shame, worthlessness, and alienation.
It's like carrying this extra burden, this added layer of stress and adversity on top of everything else.
Exactly. And it can really take a toll on a person's mental well-being.
And then finally, there's the issue of social isolation. That's something we hear a lot about these days, especially with the rise of social media and technology.
It's true. And it's important to remember that humans are social creatures. We're wired for connection. And when we're isolated from others, it can lead to feelings of loneliness, emptiness, and a lack of purpose.
So nurturing social connections, building strong relationships, and fostering a sense of community are essential for mental well-being.
Absolutely. And for nurses, this means encouraging patients to connect with loved ones, participate in social activities, and build those supportive networks. It's about recognizing that mental health is not just an individual issue, it's a social one.
It's about understanding the web of connections that make up a person's life and how those connections can either support or hinder their mental health.
Precisely. And with that, maybe we can take a break here. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, from the historical context to the nature-nurture debate to these crucial social and environmental factors.
It's clear that mental health is incredibly complex and multifaceted and deeply intertwined with the social fabric of our lives.
Well said. And I think this foundation is going to be really helpful as we continue to explore this topic.
I agree. And I'm looking forward to diving into some of the more specific approaches and interventions that can support mental well-being.
Me too.
So we've talked a lot about those broader social and environmental influences on mental health, but what about the individual? Where does personal responsibility come in?
That's a great question. And it's one that our sources tackle really thoughtfully. It's not about blaming individuals for their mental health challenges, but rather about recognizing that even within challenging circumstances, there are things people can do to influence their well-being.
Okay, so even if someone has experienced trauma or faces those systemic barriers we discussed, they still have some agency in their mental health journey.
Exactly. It's not about dismissing those external factors, but about empowering individuals to take an active role in their own recovery.
I like that. So how do we balance those two perspectives, the impact of external forces and the individual's capacity for change?
Well, a straight-talking introduction to the causes of mental health problems introduces this really helpful concept called formulation.
Formulation. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It's about moving beyond simply diagnosing a mental illness and instead creating a personalized story or formulation for each individual that takes into account their unique experiences, strengths, and vulnerabilities.
So it's like a more holistic assessment,
Yeah.
more than just checking boxes on a symptom checklist.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole person. And the book suggests using what they call the 4 Ps to guide this formulation process.
Oh, I love a good mnemonic. Lay it on me. What are the 4 Ps?
Okay, so the 4 Ps are predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors.
Okay, I'm following so far. Break it down for me, starting with predisposing factors. What are those?
Think of predisposing factors as the groundwork. They're the things in a person's past, their personal history, that might make them more susceptible to mental health difficulties later in life.
So things like childhood trauma, difficult family dynamics, maybe even a genetic predisposition to certain conditions.
Exactly. All of those things can contribute. It's like laying the foundation for a building. If the foundation is weak or has cracks, the building is more likely to crumble under stress.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So the predisposing factors are the cracks in the foundation. Got it. What about precipitating factors?
Precipitating factors are the triggers. They're the events that actually kick off a mental health crisis.
So for someone with those cracks in the foundation we talked about, a precipitating factor might be the event that causes the foundation to finally give way.
Exactly. It's like that final straw that breaks the camel's back.
And these triggers can be big things like a major life change or a traumatic event, but
Mhm.
they can also be seemingly small things, right? Things that might not seem like a big deal to someone else, but can be really overwhelming for someone who's already vulnerable.
Absolutely. It really depends on the individual and their unique set of predisposing factors. One person might be able to cope with a job loss relatively easily, while another person might find it completely debilitating.
So it's about understanding what pushes each individual over the edge, what activates those underlying vulnerabilities. Okay, so we've got the groundwork and the triggers.
Yeah.
What about perpetuating factors? What are those?
Perpetuating factors are the things that keep the problem going, the things that prevent recovery.
So if precipitating factors are the triggers, perpetuating factors are the things that keep the fire burning.
I like that analogy. Yes, exactly. And these factors can be internal things like negative thought patterns, unhealthy coping mechanisms, avoidance behaviors, or they can be external, like ongoing stress, financial problems, or lack of social support.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The initial trigger sets things in motion, and then these perpetuating factors make it really hard to break free.
Right. It's like being stuck in a rut and you keep spinning your wheels but not making any progress.
And for nurses, I imagine recognizing these perpetuating factors is crucial, right? If you can figure out what's keeping someone stuck, you can start to develop strategies to interrupt those patterns.
Absolutely. It's like identifying those roadblocks and finding ways to clear the path towards recovery.
Okay, and that brings us to the final P, protective factors.
Ah, yes. Protective factors are like the scaffolding that supports the structure, the things that buffer against stress, build resilience, and promote recovery.
So if the other three Ps are the risks, protective factors are the positive forces.
You got it. And these can be internal qualities like a strong sense of self, good coping skills, a positive outlook, or they can be external supports like strong relationships, a sense of community, or access to helpful resources.
So it's about identifying both the vulnerabilities and the strengths, the risk factors and the protective factors.
Exactly. And this 4PS framework can be so valuable for nurses. By taking the time to understand each patient's unique story, their predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors, you can tailor your care to their specific needs and really support their journey towards recovery.
It's about personalized care, recognizing that everyone's experience is different. No one-size-fits-all approach.
Precisely. Now, speaking of different experiences, one of the things our sources emphasize is that mental health exists on a spectrum.
So it's not always a clear-cut you have it or you don't
All
situation.
right. What mental illness really is and what it isn't really drives this point home. It points out that many experiences that we associate with mental illness, things like anxiety, sadness, even hearing voices or seeing things, can occur in varying degrees throughout the population.
So how do we determine when those experiences cross the line from being normal to being a sign of a mental health problem? Where do we draw that line?
Well, it's not always easy and there's no magic formula, but generally it comes down to looking at the intensity, frequency, and duration of those experiences, as well as their impact on the person's life.
So, for example, if someone hears a voice once or twice, it might not be a big deal, but if they're constantly hearing voices that are distressing or interfering with their ability to function, that's a different story.
Exactly. And it's the same with other experiences like anxiety or sadness. We all feel those things sometimes. It's part of being human. But when those feelings become so intense or persistent that they're causing significant distress or impairment, that's when it might be time to seek professional help.
Okay, that makes sense. And this whole concept of a spectrum is really helpful. It encourages us to be less judgmental and more curious, more open to understanding the nuances of human experience.
Exactly. And it reminds us that we're all on this continuum of mental health and everyone deserves support regardless of where they fall on that spectrum.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the four Ps, this idea of formulation and the importance of understanding mental health as a spectrum. Now, I want to touch on something that I know a lot of people are curious about, the role of biology, specifically the brain. We've all heard about chemical imbalances and brain abnormalities.
Yeah.
How much do those factors actually contribute to mental health problems?
Well, our sources acknowledge that biology definitely plays a role, but they caution against oversimplifying that connection. It's not as simple as saying you have depression because you have a chemical imbalance. If only it were that straightforward.
Right. If it were that simple, we'd probably have cured most mental illnesses by now. So it's more complex than just popping a pill to fix a chemical problem.
Much more complex. I mean, our brains are these incredibly dynamic and adaptable organs. They're constantly changing in response to our experiences, our thoughts, our behaviors, everything.
So it's not just about our genes. It's about how those genes interact with our environment. It's nature and nurture, once again.
Exactly. And one of the ways that scientists are trying to understand this complex interplay is through something called network theory.
Okay, network theory. Sounds interesting, but I have no idea what that is.
It's basically a way of understanding how different regions of the brain work together. It's not just about individual brain regions, it's about how those regions communicate and interact, forming these interconnected networks that support different functions.
So functions like thinking, feeling, making decisions.
Exactly. Those kinds of things. It's like thinking about a city's transportation system. You've got all these different roads and highways, and if there's a traffic jam in one area, it can disrupt the flow of traffic throughout the entire city.
So a disruption in a brain network can lead to problems in how we think, feel, and behave.
Precisely. It's not always a straightforward cause and effect relationship, but these network disruptions can definitely contribute to mental health challenges.
Okay, that makes sense. So how does this apply to nursing? How can nurses use this knowledge of brain networks in their practice?
Well, it's not about nurses becoming neuroscientists or anything like that. It's more about having a general understanding that mental health is not just about mind over matter. There's a real biological component, these complex interactions happening in the brain that can influence a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So it's about taking a more holistic and nuanced view of mental health, recognizing that there are multiple layers at play: biological, psychological, social, and environmental.
Exactly. And this multi-layered understanding can inform how you approach patient care, how you assess their needs, and how you develop treatment plans.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about biological and psychological factors, but what about those broader social and cultural influences? I mean, we touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper.
I agree. And one of the key points that all of our sources make is that mental health doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's deeply embedded in social and cultural norms, values, and beliefs.
So what might be considered a mental illness in one culture might be seen as perfectly normal or even desirable in another.
Exactly. I mean, think about something like hearing voices. In some cultures, that might be interpreted as a sign of spiritual giftedness, while in other cultures, it's viewed as a symptom of a serious mental illness.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic difference in interpretation. So how can nurses navigate these cultural differences when they're working with patients from diverse backgrounds?
It's about being really attuned to cultural sensitivity, asking open-ended questions, actively listening to the patient's perspective, and not imposing our own assumptions or biases on their experiences.
It sounds like a lot of it comes down to humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that our own cultural lens might not be the only way to see things.
I think that's a really important point. Humility is crucial in mental health care. It's about being open to learning from our patients, from their experiences, and from their cultures.
It's about recognizing the individual within their cultural context.
Precisely. And this cultural lens is essential for providing effective and compassionate care. It's about meeting patients where they are and understanding their unique perspectives.
This deep dive is really highlighting the layers of complexity involved in understanding mental health. We've explored the biological, the psychological, the social, the cultural. It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It is, but I think that's also what makes it so fascinating. And as we move into the next part of our discussion, we're going to explore how technology, particularly social media, is adding yet another layer of complexity to this landscape.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. It feels like everyone's glued to their screens these days. So how is all this screen time, social media use, and constant connectivity impacting our mental well-being?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that we're going to tackle head-on in the next part of our deep dive.
It really does feel like technology, especially social media, is this huge force shaping how we see ourselves and the world around us. I mean, is it changing our brains too?
Well, it's definitely changing how our brains function, that's for
Yeah.
sure. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. They're constantly rewiring themselves in response to our experiences. And technology is definitely shaping those experiences.
Right, and like you said, it's not a simple good or bad thing. There's nuance here.
Absolutely. And that's where our sources come in, providing some balanced perspectives on this whole technology and mental health debate. I think what mental illness really is and what it isn't had some really interesting insights.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Yeah.
What are some of the potential risks that our sources highlighted when it comes to technology and mental health?
Well, one that comes up a lot, and for good reason, is this idea of social comparison. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with images of seemingly perfect lives on social media, people with flawless bodies, amazing vacations, perfect relationships. It's easy to start feeling like you don't measure up.
Right. And that can really take a toll on self-esteem, especially for young people who are already trying to figure out who they are and where they fit in.
Exactly. And there's growing evidence to suggest that this kind of constant social comparison can contribute to feelings of anxiety, depression, and even body image issues.
Yeah, it's like everyone's presenting this curated version of themselves online, and it's hard not to compare yourself to that and feel like you're coming up short.
Right. It creates this sense of inadequacy and pressure to live up to these unrealistic standards. And the thing is, we know these online personas are often carefully constructed. They don't reflect reality. But it's hard to remember that when you're scrolling through your feed and seeing all these seemingly perfect lives.
Okay, so social comparison is a big one. What else did our sources mention?
Another major concern is cyberbullying. I mean, bullying has always been a problem, but the internet has amplified it in some pretty scary ways.
Right. It's like the bullying follows you everywhere you go. You can't escape it.
Exactly. The anonymity of the internet can make people feel emboldened to say things they would never say to someone's face. And the reach of social media means that hurtful comments can spread like wildfire, reaching a much wider audience than traditional bullying.
And it can be so hard to control or delete those hurtful messages once they're out there.
It can. And the impact on mental health can be devastating, leading to anxiety, depression, social isolation, even suicidal thoughts in some cases. So, yeah, cyberbullying is a major concern, and it's something that everyone, parents, educators, healthcare providers, needs to be aware of.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about some of the potential downsides, but our sources also acknowledge that technology isn't all bad, right? There are some positives too.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest positives, in my opinion, is the way technology has increased access to information and support, especially for people struggling with mental health challenges.
So it can break down those barriers, geographical barriers, stigma barriers that might have prevented people from seeking help in the past.
Exactly. The internet has made it so much easier for people to find information about mental health conditions, connect with others who share similar experiences, and even access online therapy or support groups.
Right, and that can be a real lifeline, especially for people who live in rural areas or who might feel uncomfortable seeking help in person.
It can be. And it can be particularly helpful for young people who might feel more comfortable reaching out online than talking to a therapist or counselor face to face.
Okay, so increased access to information and support is a big one. What else did our sources highlight in terms of the potential benefits of technology?
Well, they also talked about the ability to build community and connect with like-minded individuals online. I mean, social media gets a lot of negative attention, and rightfully so, but it can also be a really powerful tool for fostering connection and belonging.
Right, so it's not about demonizing all technology. It's about using it mindfully and harnessing its potential for good.
Exactly. And I think that's an important message for nurses to convey to their patients, too. Technology is here to stay, so let's focus on how we can use it to support mental well-being rather than just focusing on the risks.
I like that. So it sounds like technology, particularly social media, is this double-edged sword. It has the potential for both harm and good.
That's a great way to put it. It really is about using it wisely and recognizing that it's just a tool. It's not inherently good or bad. It's how we use it that matters.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about the historical context, the nature versus nurture debate, those limitations of the medical model, the power of social and environmental factors, and now the complex role of technology. I feel like we've really explored mental health from all angles.
We have. It's been quite a journey. But I think all of these layers are important for understanding the causes of mental health problems.
I agree. And I hope our listeners, especially our nurses out there, are feeling equipped with some new knowledge and insights that they can apply to their work.
Me too. And as we wrap up this episode, I just want to emphasize one more time how important it is to listen to the stories of people with lived experience.
Right. That was a key takeaway from all of our sources. The stories are so powerful and can teach us so much.
They can, and I think they're a great reminder that behind every diagnosis, behind every symptom, there's a human being with a unique story to tell.
And as nurses, our job is to listen to those stories, to honor those experiences, and to provide compassionate and individualized care that meets each person's needs.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep advocating for a world where mental health is valued and supported.
We'll see you next time.